See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ.
You're listening to Apologetics Profile.
Welcome to The Profile. I'm your host, Daniel Ray. Great to have you along this week for part 2 of our insightful and lively discussion with the world's leading scholarly expert on the resurrection of Jesus, Dr. Gary Habermas. I spent over an hour and a half conversing with Gary recently about Volume 1 of his proposed 4-volume set on Jesus' resurrection. It is his life's labor of love. Volume 1 is over 1,000 pages and is likely the only volume of its kind to have so many citations in one place from New Testament scholars who do not accept Jesus' literal bodily resurrection from the dead. So if you already think you know all there is to know about Gary's minimal facts argument, you might want to reconsider. This hefty tome sheds a great deal of behind-the-scenes background light on minimal facts, much of which was eye-opening and enlightening for me personally. Gary has sometimes been criticized by skeptics as not charitably representing the actual views of scholars he's studied. And while Gary himself admits he is certainly not infallible in what he says, On the Resurrection, the Evidences contains extensive references, quotations, footnotes, professionally published journals, books, articles, and the likes that readers may pursue on their own to see whether or not Gary has misrepresented the scholars in question. Gary, in my estimation, has gone out of his way to charitably and respectfully represent the beliefs of those scholars who are not mainstream evangelical in their confessions, even when those scholars sometimes seem to make points against Gary's thesis. In fact, as you'll hear throughout our discussion, Gary speaks quite favorably, even defends agnostic atheist scholar Dr. Bart Ehrman as being an honest scholar. Ehrman is quoted numerous times throughout On the Resurrection. Gary's book is not a work of superficial quote mining by an evangelical Christian trying to score apologetics points with his critics. It is an extensively thorough and intelligent documentation of liberal scholars who affirm that certain key aspects of the gospel accounts and the New Testament in general are historically trustworthy. But by focusing on these minimal facts upon which a majority of liberal scholars accept as historical, Gary is not saying that the rest of the Bible is historically questionable. As noted last week, through his lifetime of studying the best liberal scholarship available, Gary found a peculiar repeating pattern in their work, namely that despite the fact these scholars deny Jesus' bodily resurrection, they were nevertheless affirming a number of facts surrounding Jesus' divinity, death, and resurrection as historically credible. Minimal facts is not an end-all, be-all apologetic defense of the resurrection. It is but one unique approach in defending the resurrection, part of a much larger cumulative case for the overall truth of the Christian faith. And in addition to a broad historical overview of liberal scholarship on the New Testament, On the Resurrection also features an appendix on near-death experiences, or NDEs. As liberal New Testament scholar Dale Allison wrote in the opening comments of the book, quote, Habermas's argument from evidential near-death experiences and a likely afterlife to resurrection appearances of some sort is a useful addition to the literature, end quote. But NDEs are somewhat controversial for many Christians and non-Christians alike, so why even mention them? What exactly do they tell us about an afterlife, or about the resurrection itself? On part 2 here, Gary will give us some insight about his inclusion of NDEs in his book. During our conversation, I also mentioned to Gary that I thought on a secondary level, his book helped me to see the influential undercurrents of the growing unbelief we've seen since the beginning of the 21st century. In a way, these liberal scholars' denial of the resurrection wasn't just an exercise in textual criticism, but a not-so-implicit eating up of Western civilization in which they all dwell. If one devours the resurrection with a maw of scholarly unbelief, it is not just Christianity that is false, but it is the whole edifice of Western civilization which is poised to be swallowed up with it. It is my belief that the benefit of On the Resurrection is that we can find within these liberal critiques of the resurrection solid historical footing. Despite the acidic digestive juices of deconstructionist skepticism, in fact, even within them, there still remains solid historical ground upon which we can stand regarding Jesus' rising from the dead. Gary's work reminds me of what Joseph said in Genesis 50:20 about the maltreatment of his brothers. Quote, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." End quote. For believers, God works all things together for our good and for His glory in Christ Jesus. I think Gary's book is case in point. If these cadre of skeptical critics have anything to teach us, it is that the gospel accounts and the New Testament as a whole are the most historically reliable documents we have in existence today from the ancient world. The other thing that I think that you show, whether it's directly or indirectly, is that it's not just New Testament critical scholars going after the text of the Gospels in the New Testament. It really is, whether they're intending to do this or not, it really is a kind of reconstruction of of the Western theological culture, in a sense. So you're not just dismantling and throwing a question mark on the resurrection, but by doing so, Gary, they're functionally trying to reconfigure Western society. I don't know if they're conscious of this, because if you question the central hope and the central historical moment of our culture, the Western theological tradition of Catholics, Protestants, and Greek Orthodox, well, the Eastern tradition is, I'd still lump them in there as Christians. But if you question all that, then what you've done in this book is to show me, I've seen this more clearly, the strains, the undercurrents of postmodernity in the voices of these skeptics, and how they're not just questioning the cross, but they're bringing with them a deluge of skepticism and postmodern thinking that you can see, here's where that comes from, David Strauss. Here's where that comes from, Gerhard Ludemann. Here's where this comes from. Here's where all this is coming from. And so here we are sitting on this iceberg called deconstruction today in our culture. But if you go under the surface of the water, that iceberg goes all the way down to David Strauss, David Hume. And so your book brings out those threads of thought, not just in questioning the resurrection, but the very thoughts and ideas that have been undermining our culture now for over 150 years. Here they are.
Yeah, well, if I do that, you're the first one to have said that of all the people I've done interviews with, or even go back while I was doing all the writing. If I do that, I was doing that, A, because I was there, been there, done that. And secondly, because I think understanding those guys is the only way to do it. You know what? I hope people are getting this idea. One guy wrote a comment. We're talking about my book, On the Resurrection, the big 1,100-page almost book. Mm-hmm. On the Resurrection, Evidences. And one guy was writing a comment about it on Amazon, and he said, "You quote Bart Ehrman more than anybody." And you can't even do justice to his views. I mean, like, you quote him all the time, but you don't believe what he's saying. Or I don't know what it was, but he's saying you quote him a lot, but he's not a believer like you, like that. Mm-hmm. But I've already said several positive things about Bart. I quote Bart more than almost anybody for a couple of reasons. One is, I think Bart is an honest critic. Does he make mistakes? Yeah, but I'd like to be called an honest Christian scholar. Do I make mistakes? Yes, we all make mistakes. But I find Bart saying a lot of good things. Like here's an example. Within pages, he says, the Gospels are not reliable. A few pages later, here's a few pages where they give some facts that are really reliable. And you have to distinguish between, in his mind, books that are not entirely reliable and the same books giving us really useful facts about Jesus. And Bart will say both. And Bart will give you lists of things that you wouldn't expect him to say. Example, you have to get this from several places because I don't know where he says it in any one place, but I may have missed it. He gives, we already said multiple attestation is a great criterion. Bart gives 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus, part of the Christian gospel, deity, death, resurrection. 15 independent sources for the resurrection, and a number of them are not in the New Testament. A couple at least, maybe as many as 4, are not Christian. But he says they all, and he goes 100 years. He's willing to go 100 years. What can I find in 100 years? So he would be going for Jesus. He would be going 30 AD to 130 AD. And he finds all this list of sources, and 15 of them for the crucifixion. That is outstanding. He knows it's part of the gospel message, and he's honest enough to tell Christians, you guys have some good sources. Your books aren't reliable. Gospels aren't reliable, but you got some good data here. Then he says some really good things about the creeds. He says that virtually every creed that appears in Paul's epistles, Paul may have gotten them, knew about them, or got them by the time he went up to Jerusalem at 35 or 36 AD and spent 15 days with Peter and James. He said they may all have come from that period. Wow, you mean the most important creeds in the New Testament may be no more than 5 or 6 years old? He says in a couple places that a couple of these sermon summaries in Acts or other roughly in that big group called creedal or traditions, he says they're a year or two after the cross. James Dunn, Jimmy Dunn, as he's known, he says the resurrection the first creed might have been dated in the same year in which Jesus died. Now, he doesn't say that literally, but here's how you get that. We know Jesus died in the spring, and Dunn said the thing was probably just months afterwards. Well, if it's in the spring and you got months to go, it very well could be the same year. I've got a German scholar, New Testament scholar, up on my shelf here, looking right up at him, and he says that the 1 Corinthians 15 goes back to 30 AD. Gerrit Ludemann says that the message of the resurrection was preached immediately after the events. Immediately. Oh, what are you, evangelical? No, I'm an atheist. Oh, well, that's interesting. And Daniel, if I could use one example, I think Bart's defending himself, and he thinks he said enough positive things about the gospel that some people are going to think he's cheating a little bit, and maybe he's a little more of a believer than he thinks he is, that kind of thing. Yeah. And Bart, the question he raises is, do I accept these things because the Bible says so? And he goes, baloney. I don't even think the Gospels are reliable. So I don't accept these things. And he's talking about the 15 sources for the crucifixion. 15 sources of the crucifixion. And he says, no, I don't accept. And people accuse me, why do you quote Paul? You're quoting the enemy. Why do you quote Paul? And Bart says, because Paul's a darn good source. And here's the illustration he uses, and I love this. He says, if I am writing a book about the Revolutionary War, do I refuse to interview General, later President Washington, the first president of the United States? Do I refuse to interview him because that would be like quoting Paul in the New Testament? He said, that's a bunch of baloney. Of course I'm going to quote General Washington, whether I agree with him or don't agree with him. He has a perspective that I can't find in anybody else. So yes, Washington will be a major part of my book on the Revolutionary War. And that's the exact same way we go after this data. These guys say things, you go, well, you pick and choose. You only speak when they like it and don't when they don't, really? So why do I have 150 pages on German liberalism and all the things they say about the resurrection if I'm just picking and choosing? I'm letting you know what they say. I'm giving refutations, but I'm telling you what they say. So I've only been with Bart one time, very briefly. I find him to be honest. I think he's honest. I don't think I've ever said this in an interview, but I wish he lived next door to me and that he liked football and he could come over every Sunday afternoon and he and I could just talk all the way through the program. I think we'd be good friends. So I mean this stuff positively, but that's not to sidestep the fact that he doesn't think the Gospels are literal. He just knows where the factual data are. So I cite him a lot.
Right. And I, getting back to what I'd said earlier, I know it wasn't your intention to lay out the fact that here's the roots of deconstruction in the modern West, but knowing what these liberal scholars say in opposition to the Gospels have made people nervous, Gary, that you're bringing these folks to bear on historical support for the Bible. A lot of people have questioned your minimal facts as if it's to say that there's everything else is questionable facts. You've boiled it down to these few, and now you've called into question all the other ones by not saying that these too are also historical. And I know you've dealt with that before. How do you address that, Gary, in terms of you're not saying by these minimal facts that the rest of the Bible is historically questionable. You've just taken a particular niche of liberal scholars and showed where the solidity is. Is that?
I'm glad you asked that, Daniel. I like that question because it allows me to answer it. Don't forget, this book came out in January, about 5 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
Don't forget, when you write a book of this size, you write it years ago, and it takes the time to be double, triple edited, which this book was, to go to the binders, to go to the everything. And by the time it comes out, it's already, like maybe my most recent source is 5 years old, 3 years old, because that's how long it takes to get a book out. I didn't do this to answer that question. In fact, while you're doing that, let me grab this just to make a comment, because I wouldn't want to say that off the top of my head and be wrong. If people think, oh, maybe you think the minimal facts are the only ones worth talking about, really? Well, part 5 in this book is called The Gospel Resurrection Data. And I have 6 chapters on the Gospels and the first 11 verses of the book of Acts, because they're all relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And for what looks like almost 200 printed pages, I'm telling you why the Gospels are reliable. In fact, what I do, I have a lecture on my YouTube site where I say sources behind our Gospels. Do people know, for example, that probably it's probably the major view that Mark used what's called a pre-Markan passion narrative, and he used a source. Who knows who it was by? But he used a source that goes maybe from Jesus's interrogation all the way to the cross. And he uses a source, at least. And a lot of scholars think he went all the way to the empty tomb, that the empty tomb was recorded. And Mark had this source. Whoa. And when did this come out? Well, I know a couple of agnostics who believe that source dates no later than the late 30s AD. A couple of agnostic New Testament scholars date that source in the 30s. Okay. What if he knew that John, according to a fair number of scholars, John relies on a source called a miracles document. And it's a source being passed around that lists maybe, we don't have it, maybe just Jesus' miracles. But John starts citing from those, and they're way before John. How do we know he's using a miracle source? Well, in John chapter 2, Jesus goes to the wedding at Cana in Galilee, and he changes the water to wine, and it says this is now his first miracle. Why does it say this is his first miracle? Then later it says, now his second miracle was, why is he counting 1 and 2? And they think that he's making reference to this as far as we know, non-existent book right now, but he had early sources. Mark uses that. Luke, companion of Paul. Luke's a scholar in himself. The guy knows how to do research. Paul's a Pharisee. Paul's got basically a PhD in Old Testament. And Luke's, Paul says, Luke, the physician, was a good friend of mine. I mean, he's good. He's faithful. Mm-hmm. These guys have sources that are way before the Gospels. And so I argue for the reliability of the sources. So that should both answer the view that Gary Habermas doesn't like reliability arguments, and the more radical view that he thinks every other fact besides these, there are 12 that I moved down to 6, right. And those 6 are the minimal facts. The rest of them. In fact, I'll give you a third argument, Daniel. Mike Licona and Ben Shaw are my two most accomplished students with regard to resurrection publications. Mike's got a big 750-page book on the resurrection, doctoral dissertation. Ben's already done 20-something publications, probably half or more on the resurrection. And Mike is just published his second book on gospel reliability. Now, you may not like the way he argues for it, but don't say the guys who use the minimal facts argument, as Mike is committed to, don't say he doesn't trust the Gospels, because he's doing a second book, and one was published by Oxford, for crying out loud. Ben, the second one, has a book coming out in June, and I think he gives a baker's dozen, 13 separate arguments for the reliability of the New Testament. And some of these arguments are very creative. You never find them all in one place. But here's a guy who's committed. He's done his master's and PhD dissertation on the minimal facts, and yet now he's doing a book on reliability. So we are not at all against reliability or proving that there's many, 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 many other facts besides deity, death, and resurrection gospel verses.
Yes,
so
yes.
I appreciate you giving me a chance to do that, because that is a question that's aimed at me a fair number of times.
Yeah, I've heard it. I've seen it. And my takeaway now from reading this book in its entirety and having a far more better grasp on what you're trying to accomplish with minimal facts, I would just say that, well, somebody asked me, I said, well, what's Gary's book all about? Well, in the course of his research, over the lifetime of research he's done on this, he's actually stumbled onto a pattern. In reading liberal scholarship, actually being a doubter himself, he stumbled onto a pattern. And the pattern is this: within the liberal camp, there's enough information there to demonstrate the credibility of the resurrection. And to me, that you've just found a pattern. You're not limiting the Gospels to this pattern. You're just saying you found a pattern, and here it is.
Yeah, and what they take from the Gospels, obviously, it's like a duh comment. They accept far less out of the Gospels than we do.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say, even if I accept your far less number of verses or facts, what can I do with them? I'm looking at a book over here. I'm doing some stuff right now, the D.D. Price, for my 4th volume. And there's a New Testament scholar, Royce Grunler, from Gordon Conwell Seminary, who did a similar argument. I'm not saying he used me. This book's been out for decades. He did a argument for Jesus' deity, where he claims that even if you use the Boltmannian camp and what they think are the most reliable comments made by Jesus, the ones we know he really made, even if you use only those comments, Jesus claimed to be deity. Mm-hmm. It's on the deity of Christ. It's a minimal argument using the most skeptical New Testament scholarship camp and saying, hey, you guys know you let these 30, 40 verses go in the Gospels? I can use those and get the deity of Christ out of that. Now what do you think about the deity of Christ?
Yeah.
So other guys do this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. It's absolutely, I think, in our day and age, something that we desperately need, a way to look at the historical truths of what we believe and to be more informed about what our non-Christian friends believe and how we can better articulate and have that conversation. There's a whole appendix in your book, as you know. One of I have a literary background. I used to teach English to middle and high school students, so I like poetry. And I've been reading Roger Lundine's book about the biography of Emily Dickinson. Roger, as a Wheaton scholar, passed away in 2015. But his book about Emily Dickinson is delightful. But one of my favorite Emily Dickinson poems begins with, I heard a fly buzz when I died. And as I was reading your book, Gary, I'm thinking this is exactly what NDEs are. These aren't just poets waxing eloquently about what life might be like after death. You actually have some seriously documented cases where people describe things that they see and hear after they're dead. Gary, why do you have a whole section on this weird thing? What's the point of that?
I love the fact that you're bringing things out that some people might criticize. And you and I, Daniel, you can tell anybody, and so would I. We didn't talk about this before we went on the air.
No, we did not.
We did not.
And
you didn't email it to me. You just said, we've done a lot of things together, and you just said, hey, let's do it. And I said, let's do it. But you're asking questions that I'd love a chance to answer. Why NDEs in a book that has nothing to do with it?
Right.
Well, Dale Allison is one of the recommenders in the book, and they put the recommenders in alphabetical order. So Dale's first, and he says something like, Habermas's argument from evidence near-death experiences to the resurrection appearances is an additional argument that we need to consider, or something like that. Here's why. In a world where people say all we have are atoms and nothing but empirical data, and there's no God and there's nothing else, and there's no afterlife. Bertrand Russell is famous for saying, in order to be a theist, you basically need God and an afterlife. To be a Christian, you need God and afterlife, and Jesus has to be a really good guy. That's really how he says it. Jesus has to be a spectacular person.
Yeah.
And so I went back and I thought, okay, I got interested in reading NDEs because I got into the resurrection. Why? Because my doubt was framed by the two closest people in my life dying. The closest person earlier in my life, and then by the mother of my 4 children dying of stomach cancer when she was only 43 years old.
Mm.
And so death has always been on my mind. And I jumped into the resurrection because I wanted to know, not knowing anything about the resurrection, I wanted to know if there was an afterlife. Would I see so-and-so and so-and-so again? That's how I started. And so I started reading some NDEs, and I've accumulated a list of over 300 evidential cases. Now, some of them are very mild evidence. You wouldn't even put them out there if you wanted to put your best foot out there. But a few dozen of them are very heavy. For example, there are over 4 dozen cases now, where, as far as we know, the person who's reporting did not have any heart or brain activity while they gave the evidence that could be corroborated out in the street. They're in a windowless room being operated on, and they report, I'm just making things up, they report a car accident, and there's police reports on it. There's eyewitnesses. They report a storm and something going on in this branch. They saw this branch go right through a home, and they got the eerie picture of this house being crushed by this, anything. But their brain wasn't operating, neither was their heart. And so I argue that it's very difficult to talk about evidence near-death experiences and not get some kind of afterlife. Now, I'll go time out. If there is some kind of afterlife, you, the skeptic, you have a much harder job with the resurrection than you thought you had. Because if you think this world is all there is, but I'm arguing there's an afterlife, and the resurrection is in the same genre of NDEs because they both concern the afterlife. If there's an afterlife, don't be so prejudiced against the resurrection. Now, if they were being honest, they might say, it's not the resurrection I'm prejudiced against, it's what I'm going to have to believe if I'm a Christian, because we're back to the worldview thing. Mm-hmm. But that's why I do NDEs, because a lot of my teaching now, volume 2 is refutations of alternative theories, and I will frequently bring NDEs up as additional refutations, because if your refutation is, oh, and by the way, there is no afterlife, the natural world is all there is, I'll go, time out, let's talk about NDEs. So it becomes something that, as Dale Allison was kind enough to say, it figures into data for the resurrection because there's already an afterlife. Don't make so much fun of the resurrection until you study it.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you put it in there. I mean, Christians, we got to be careful of the implications. Of course, some people can take it in different directions, but I think the thing that it reminded me of, Gary, in that section was something that Bart Ehrman has said, and actually said to me personally on our Atheist and Christian Book Club a couple of years ago about this worldview issue. And because I'd asked him the perennial question he gets all the time, Bart, if the resurrection didn't happen, of course, we're all still in our sins, but if it didn't happen, Dr. Ehrman, what did? And of course, this gets into and I know you addressed this in Volume 2, but there's no, and you do talk about it a little bit in Volume 1 here, there's really no tenable alternative to the resurrection from a naturalistic perspective. And so Dr. Ehrman will sort of be non-committal about taking a position, and I want to be charitable to him. He presently said to me, to me personally, he said, well, I just think that they were mistaken. But he's not going to commit to what did they see. And a lot of people won't commit to that because there's not the kind of evidence for an alternative that there is for the actual resurrection. But one thing, and I'll close with this, one thing he said to me that I think I see throughout these scholarly objections to the resurrection was along the lines of what he says about how historians can't assess miracle claims. But as a historian, Dr. Ehrman has assessed this miracle claim and has found it wanting. He calls it a mistake. So it goes back to what you said earlier about him saying it's reliable, it's not reliable. Here's some reliable stuff, but it's not reliable. A historian can't make a judgment about miracles, but my judgment on this miracle is they were mistaken. And it's kind of frustrating for lay people like myself to be able to come back with that. How would you respond briefly to somebody who makes that kind of a claim about historians being unable to examine miracle claims?
Well, first of all, I don't think he's disagreeing with his own rules. There's one more place where I really like Bart, where I think he's really honest. Bart, it would say to you, Daniel, if you listen to my words, I'm not saying I can't talk about miracles, but the resurrection didn't happen. When I say the resurrection didn't happen, I'm talking about this worldly story. There's a man named Jesus. He walks and talks. We know certain things, a lot of other things we're not so sure about. He had some disciples, something happened to them, whatever, and the story of resurrection got spread around. I'm commenting on what happened in this world. I don't know what happened in eternity or if there is an eternity. I'm speaking as if I'm Bart.
Sure.
In fact, my view, Bart's talking, my view is that this world is all there is. So when I criticize the resurrection, I'm using this worldly data. I don't venture into heavenly stuff to refute it, because then I would be crossing my own line and you'd be right. But find a place where I cross that line and I'll cross it out of my next edition, because I don't want to be commenting about the miraculous part. I only want to talk about what the disciples really say. And I tend to think they're mistaken because I'm an atheist. And as you know, he identifies himself as either an agnostic or an atheist, depending on which type of question you're talking about. But he can be called an atheist. I think he's comfortable with that. But he also says in his book, How Did Jesus Become God? He says, I will not pick a naturalistic theory. He said, when I used to be an evangelical, we used to love it when critics picked naturalistic theories, because we would parade all these arguments out. He said, but I'm not going to pick one. Personally, I think he doesn't pick one because he's got this idea in the back of his mind that if he chooses one and he gets blasted in a debate, he's going to look really bad for standing on one. So I think he'd rather take that view, which he says there. He goes, look, I don't think the disciples stole the body. That's silly. But it's more likely than a miracle. Why?
Yeah,
because miracles don't happen. That's right. Well, where did you get that view? Where does that come from? And you'd have to discuss it. So I don't think he's crossing his own line. I think he's using this worldly events, the things that historians can talk about, to say why I don't think there's anything beyond that. Now, we'd have to discuss those things. But
all right.
Again, I find him to be rather straightforward. He gets bothered when Christians push him and say nasty things about him, but so do I. In interviews, some guys have said some pretty nasty things to me, and you can see some things on my website where I go off on a couple of guys. Say, you got an answer? We'll talk. Huh? You got something to say? Say something. Say it right now. I do that at a couple of interviews.
Yes.
I get bothered too.
Yeah, we're all human. I mean, I mean to be charitable to Dr. Ehrman, but I can see the point of how the worldview, and I think this is a key, and I tend to be superficial in this regard, but I'm learning, is to really listen intently to what people of other worldviews are actually saying to you. I mean, because that's what you've done so well with these liberal scholars. I don't think anybody can accuse you of misrepresenting them. Maybe somebody, if anybody that does, Gary, I would say that they probably didn't read this book all the way through, because you go out of your way to show how closely to the very speech that they're using, how carefully you are representing their words.
See, people do say that, but I appreciate your going on record, and I appreciate you in this interview letting me talk about 2 or 3 areas, whether it's historical postmodernism, where I have a whole chapter on it, or the one about you don't believe in any other facts, just these 12, and then the 6 from which you get the minimal facts. That's another one. What do you about the rest of the Gospels? So do you seem like Bart Ehrman more than I do, somebody else talking. I'd say, no, I'm trying to be honest. I think he's trying to be honest, and I'm trying to be honest. That's why I cite him more than anybody else. It's because I think he's a guy that we could be good friends and chat together.
Well, and he's the one that's out there writing bestsellers, and it is even a surprise to him that a agnostic atheist New Testament scholar could write New York Times bestselling books, but equally wonderful, and I think a testament to the reality of Christianity and to Jesus in your life, sir, is how God took a hockey coach from Detroit and made him write a 4-volume work on the resurrection. That's a remarkable story, perhaps for another time. But
as I told you before we went on the air, there is a time when I say I'm not getting tired of it. It's my first love, this topic, but I want to write about some other things. And by the way, we talked about reliability. Beyond this book, I published other things on reliability in the New Testament. So somebody shouldn't, if they know my stuff, they really shouldn't be thinking I'm thinking the rest of the New Testament is. All you got to do is ask yourself this: where does this guy teach? Liberty University. Oh, well, then he can't have that view. I priori, he can't have that view. So anyway.
Yeah, no. Final thoughts, Gary. We could chat for another 2 hours, but
I guess the only thing I'd say is if anybody wants to see further information, my website is garyhabermas.com. I guess www.garyhabermas.com, and my website, that's my website. If they go to YouTube, they can look me up. And I think I don't do much I do the speaking, but somebody else does my website, the YouTube. And I think he just told me recently we have 250 items there. There are a lot of things on doubt, if people are hurting. There's a lot of things on the resurrection. There's a lot of things on historical Jesus. There are some things that are only 1 or 2 or 3 minutes long, and there are some things that are 2 hours long. So wide variety. I hope people can either go to the YouTube site or to the website and find more material, and people will get into, a lot of things in NDEs in both sites.
Yeah.
So if all we know is that there's a resurrection, if all we know that there is an afterlife, and you don't get eternity, you don't get eternal life out of NDEs, you just get some afterlife. But if there's some afterlife, you got to be more open to the resurrection. So if that interests a person, they can go there and find out some of these 4 dozen cases and other things with some really good evidence. So that was it. Well, just to look at my 2 sites, and they're there for ministry. I told my PhD students it's all about ministry, and I hope they'll be used that way. I appreciate you having me on and letting me say this, and most of all, Daniel, without us talking about it, you bringing up the questions that I would most want to answer, because I get questions there. Am I a closet liberal? To which the short question is, look again where I teach. You must think only these facts. So well, look again where I teach, or look where I've defended other things. Just if they will take the whole body of work, I think they'll say these critiques are not fair.
You've been listening to Apologetics Profile, a podcast ministry of Watchman Fellowship, Incorporated. For more information about our ministry and resources, visit our website at watchman.org.